Hey guys, this is Jeff Stanek here with Figured Out Baseball. We've got another Figured Out Baseball podcast today, and today we're doing something a little bit different than what we traditionally do. Today we are joined by Brian Goebel. Brian is living in Southern California now, and he's got an analytics background, and we'll hear a little more about his background in a bit. But his analytics background before recently did not extend into baseball, but recently he started doing some analytics, some baseball analytics, and that's why he's joining us today, just to talk about how analytics and different statistics are making their way into the game and how we learn from that and adapt. And the game has been changing a bit recently because of analytics. So we've got Brian here today just to talk about some of the research that he's done and just to have a good discussion about analytics in baseball. So Brian, if you don't mind, I'd like to give you a chance just to introduce yourself to the audience here and give a little bit of your background and how you went from what your previous job was to how you kind of got into baseball and just give people a better idea of who you are and where you're coming from.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast with you today. So I have what I would characterize as a classic liberal arts or eclectic professional background. I'm an attorney by training, and I did practice law for a number of years in the 1990s and early 2000s. After September 11th, 2001, I went into government service, initially in the Treasury Department, and then ultimately in the Department of Homeland Security, where I worked for a number of years on primarily border security related matters. And this is where I was first exposed to what I would sort of call modern analytics, modeling, statistics, and things of that nature. The government was using a variety of tools to try to identify high-risk people and high-risk cargo entering and exiting the United States, and I became familiar with those programs after 9/11. When I finished my government service, I went back to practicing law, but ultimately decided that I wanted to remain involved in homeland security and public policy matters, so I founded a consulting firm in 2005 that worked with private sector clients. We then branched out into doing public sector, public policy consulting, again focusing on security, and found ourselves heavily involved in risk analytics in the 2007 to 2009 timeframe. At that point, I took a look at some of the things that were being done in the federal space and had a vision that I and a team with me could do a better job of helping the government identify risk in its various transactions. And we put together some models that worked quite well. The government ended up using our work quite a bit, and so I founded an actual applied analytics firm called Sentinel Applied Analytics and grew that firm pretty dramatically in the space of about 3 years, and ultimately sold that firm to a larger analytics firm, Novetta Solutions, which is still operating today in the national security arena, both intel community and homeland security community. That background in analytics and statistics has been pretty useful in the world of baseball, obviously for all of the MLB teams that now have operations research and analytics departments. My baseball background, I grew up in Cincinnati in the 1970s, huge fan of the Big Red Machine. My dad had played Division III college baseball. I played the game when I was younger, but ultimately gave it up for soccer, but have returned to baseball pretty dramatically and significantly over the last several years as my son has begun playing and I've begun coaching. I've coached youth baseball now for the past 5 years. And with some of the changes in the game that I think we're going to get into on this podcast, I decided to take a look at some of the things that were going on in offense from a slightly different analytical perspective to see if I could come up with an alternate theory for how teams might do a better job of winning games in the current MLB environment.
And some things, Brian, that you and we've had several discussions before this podcast about various things, and one of the things that you and I have talked about is about the change in baseball that led to the research that you were doing. And just to give everyone that background and get everyone up to speed. Basically, what's transpired in major leagues and what you and I had discussed is that really in the last 2 to 3 years, it seems like all 30 major league teams have moved to an offensive style where offensive players are trying to hit the ball in the air and they're really focusing on hitting doubles and home runs and quote unquote doing damage, trying to lift the ball in the air and launch angle has become a more prominent thing in baseball. And while every baseball off the bat has a launch angle, whether it's a ground ball and it's a negative launch angle or it's a fly ball and it's a positive launch angle, everything's got one. But I think there's just been more awareness of launch angle in the past several years, and it's become a really prominent thing in Major League Baseball, and it's trickled down as things typically do. It's trickled down from the pro level to college baseball and to high school baseball, where that's something that's being measured and being taught and being thought about more by younger players is hitting the ball in the air and trying to create a launch angle that will result in doubles and home runs. And what Brian and I have talked about, and I'd like to talk about a little more now, Brian, just kind of get your thoughts about it, is basically that while all 30 teams seem to have adopted this way of playing, not all 30 teams are set up to be able to do that, particularly teams that are smaller market that don't have the funds necessary to sign prominent power hitters. A lot of those teams don't have in the National League 8 hitters and the American League 9 hitters that can just go out and try to hit doubles and home runs and have as much success as they might have with a different philosophy. And that's kind of where this whole thing started, is it not? That kind of your frustration with all teams trying to win baseball games that way offensively, again, trying to hit doubles and home runs.
Yeah, Jeff, that's an excellent summary, and I think I'll take a couple of those points and build on them. So the modern sort of current MLB environment, in my view, has really had its origins in the introduction of a new hitting and offensive statistic called the weighted on-base average, and we can discuss that at length if we want to. But that statistic, which really accentuates the importance of hitting for power and getting walks, has really transformed offensive philosophy in MLB, and as you said, I think it's trickling down to other levels of baseball. The corollary to the weighted on-base average is a de-emphasis on what I would call small ball or manufacturing runs in offensive techniques, stolen bases, bunting, productive outs, situational hitting, two-strike approaches. Those things have all been de-emphasized in the last 12 to 13 years of MLB baseball. And the results in terms of what's happening in offense and the way the game is played are pretty startling and stark. And so if you look at, for example, the hits to strikeout ratio in the National League, and I do most of my research involving NL teams, and we can get into that as well, but over the last 12 years, the hits to strikeout ratio in 2007 was 1.36 to 1, so there were more hits than there were strikeouts. In 2018, that ratio had flipped essentially to 0.97 to 1, meaning that there were more strikeouts than hits in the National League. And you're seeing and have seen a steady decrease in stolen bases, for example, over the same time frame. And that is producing, as you said, these effects in the major leagues and the way the game is played. And the style of play is clearly, as you noted, consistent across all of the programs, regardless really of whether they're good or not good at playing that style of play. And when I started my research into this issue, I looked at a couple different National League teams that were sort of in the average mix in terms of overall wins and winning percentage. And what I found on offense is they were playing the game exactly the same way the Dodgers were, who led the league in runs, et cetera. So they're playing exactly the same way, but not achieving the same results. They were striking out more, slugging less, and doing less on the bases than the Dodgers had. And so this creates an opportunity for teams to rethink how they're approaching their offensive philosophy in order to compete. more effectively in the modern game. And yeah, just to put a final point on it, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I live in Southern California. We've adopted the Dodgers as our hometown team. We moved here about 5 years ago. And sort of the genesis of the research that I did had its origins in the third game of the World Series, where the Dodgers got their leadoff runner on base 4 times in that game, and the subsequent hitter either struck out or hit a pop out, and they didn't score in those 4 innings. And of course, it went on and on and on until the Dodgers won the game on a Max Muncy walk-off home run, which unfortunately I did not get to see because I fell asleep during the 16th inning of that game. And to me, that inability to try to manufacture a run, advance runners, and win a close game was deeply frustrating. And so I wanted to take a look at what had happened to what I would call offensive consistency in Major League Baseball, and whether there was an argument to be made that more consistent teams were going to win more games. And that study had its origins, in that Game 3 of the World Series.
Just to be honest, and I think you and I both look at the game as fans, even though, we have other involvement with the game. And I think as a former college coach, even as a college coach, I'm still a fan of the game. You're still, you're not involved directly with Major League Baseball, and you're still a fan, and you're looking at it that way. And I think most people out there, outside of probably professional baseball, whether they're involved with a major league team or a minor league team, outside of those people, I think, most people that watch the game, even or if you're involved in the game at other levels, you're still a fan and you still have your favorite team. And I'll tell you that I didn't see the end of that game, at least live, and I know that most of the people were probably the same way. And baseball's just gotten to a point where it's hard to watch sometimes because the games are so long, and especially playoff games are. Like, I don't know how anybody watches those things live. It's bad enough I'll watch a replay of them, or like let the game play for about a half hour before I start it so I can skip some commercials, because the games are so incredibly long. But that's probably a podcast for another day. So you started your research, and from your paper that you produced, looking at the 2017 and 2018 Dodgers was sort of like the starting point. And the 2017 Dodgers won in the regular season. They won 104 games. And the 2018 Dodgers only won 92 games, despite the fact that the 2018 Dodgers scored more runs, had a higher they gave up more runs, but they also had a better run differential. They had a higher weighted on base percentage. They had a lower WHIP for the pitching staff. Their expected wins for both seasons was 102, but one season they produced 104 wins, the other season they produced 92. And this got you into just wondering whether a team that is more consistent scoring runs wins games. Can you kind of define, before we get any further, just what you mean by more consistent offense? I know it's sort of self-explanatory, but how did how are you putting numbers to this as an analytics person? How are you applying numbers and actual statistical data to terms like a consistent offense?
Sure. No, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. Yeah, my first look at the data was a case study looking at the 2 Dodgers seasons to see if I could find something in the data that would explain a 12-game difference in wins, given that all the other data favored a better season in 2018. And so my hypothesis was that the Dodgers offense was more consistent at scoring runs in 2017 than it had been in 2018. And so I first had to come up with a definition of consistency that made sense. And what I focused on was looking at the distribution of runs across the season in individual games, and how that compared to their average runs per game over the entire season. So that would be your mean, your average runs per game. And then looking at their scoring, games 160, 3 through 1, and determining how many of those games essentially were different than the average and how far from the average and how frequently they were off the average. And in statistical terms, the best way of measuring this is using the standard deviation, which looks at the extent to which their run production varies from their average, and also the frequency, essentially, with which it varies from the average. And so a higher standard deviation compared to the mean means that the team is less consistent in scoring runs or distributing its runs, and a lower standard deviation compared to the mean means that they are more consistent.
So for the layperson, which I'm going to be in this phone call, if a team in 6 consecutive games scores 3 runs, then 4, then 5, then 3, then 4, then 5, they average 4 runs a game.
Yep.
If a team also scores 8 runs, 6 consecutive games, they score 8 runs, then 0, then 8 runs, then 0, then 8 runs, then 0. They're still averaging 4 runs a game, but obviously 3 of those games they're not going to win because they didn't score anything. The other 3 they scored 8 and have a pretty good chance to win. But that's basically what we're getting at here, is that the team that can come the closest to their average on a consistent basis was your theory, that team would win more games. So
Right.
what did you find? What did you find in the research, and how, what sort of research did you conduct? How far back did you look? What kind of teams did you look at for this?
Yeah, so that, you got it exactly right. That was my hypothesis. That's my definition. So, in a just pure mathematical sense, if you average 5 runs per game because you score 5 runs every game, your standard deviation is 0. That's what people who are paying attention to this mathematically need to understand. And then if your runs vary dramatically, your standard deviation will be much higher. And so I've got a few different scenarios that I could calculate, but it doesn't matter. The point is, you're exactly right. The more variety and the more delta difference between the mean and the peaks and valleys in your run scoring, the higher your standard deviation is going to be. So what I decided to do was take a look at the National League, and my theory for looking at the National League, in addition to starting this because of the Dodgers, was that with the pitcher hitting, at least for the time being, there's some rules changes that are being percolated about
Hopefully
right now
not.
that we might want to get into. But with the pitcher hitting, managers have more opportunities to make strategic decisions about how they want to try to run their offense. And I thought that would produce perhaps greater variety in consistency measures across the teams. So I picked the National League, and I went back 12 years. I wanted to go back to the dawn of the weighted on-base average era, as I've defined it. So I started with the 2007 season. And then I picked only teams that had winning records in that 12-year period, because I was interested in trying to explain or figure out what makes good teams great. And if consistency is important to winning, I didn't want to study teams that were not trying to win. And we could have a whole other discussion about tanking in the current MLB environment, but it's pretty clear that in that 12-year period, there were certain teams that were playing for not this year, and maybe not even next year, but 3 or 4 years down the road. And so I wanted to exclude those teams from the study and really focus on the teams that were trying to win and reach the postseason in a given year. And so over that 12-year period, I had 88 winning seasons that I could study. And for all intents and purposes, what I did was take the run scoring distribution of every one of those 88 seasons, calculate the standard deviation from the mean, and then to compare team versus team, divided their standard deviation by their mean. And so in a simple scenario, right, if your mean run production is 5 and your standard deviation is 4, that produces a ratio of 0.8. The same team with 5 run mean but a 3 standard deviation has a 0.6 ratio, much more consistent. And this is how I could compare teams, both within a season and across the 12-year era that I studied. And let me stop there and see if you have any questions about the foundational data, and then I can get into the actual findings.
No, no, that's good. So I'm keeping up with you, and some people that I'm familiar with with a lot of those terms just as a financial my financial background. But regardless of whether people are or not, I think your findings are really where the meat and potatoes of this is, and I think where that's really I think what I'd like to get into a lot of just what your findings are
Yep.
and how we can apply that to future baseball teams.
Perfect. So what I did to really try to tease out the importance of consistency is I ran 3 different analyses, each one building on the one that came before it. So the first analysis I did was just to take a look at how well run differential explains winning percentages in baseball, just to get a rough handle on the relationship between run differential and winning percentage. And it turns out that it's not a surprise. A lot of theories in baseball are built on this signature stat, that run differential does a pretty good job of explaining win percentages. But it's not perfect, has limitations, and from a statistical standpoint, it's not quite rigorous enough that you could say this is what I want to use to explain winning percentage going forward. So I started there. The second thing I did was then break out run differential into its 2 constituent pieces, right? So you have your offensive run production, you have your defensive run production, and I looked at average runs per game on both sides of the equation, and that, as you would expect, is a more precise mechanism for predicting win totals, but it doesn't quite achieve what I would call the statistically significant threshold for predicting win totals. And so from that point, what I did was add in the consistency variable to my modeling, and I looked at standard deviation divided by mean. So this is just the percentage as my measure of offensive consistency. And when I introduced that into the model, it took us right up to what I would call sort of the magic threshold for a statistically valid model. And it showed pretty significantly that offensive consistency contributes to win totals. And the simplest way to explain how this would work practically is to take a look at how various increases in performance translate into wins over a 162-game season. And so what I found is that a 5% increase in run production would translate into roughly 2 additional wins per season. So that's finding number 1. Finding number 2 is that a 5% reduction in runs surrendered, right? So you're reducing the runs that you give up on defense would produce about 3 additional wins per season. So this is not a surprise to anyone who believes that good pitching beats good hitting. So runs against defense, defense, number 1 factor for winning games, increasing your run scoring, number 2. But what's interesting is a 5% improvement in offensive consistency translates into 1 additional win per season. So it's not as significant as maximizing your offensive output, but it does contribute to additional wins. And from there, what I wanted to do was take a look at how run scoring consistency paired with your offensive production translated into actual wins versus your predicted wins. And Jeff, here the idea that I was trying to get at is that if consistency is essentially the differentiator, the secret ingredient to winning, what we should see is that teams at every level of offensive production that are more consistent than their peers should generate more wins than predicted. And then conversely, if they're less consistent than their peers at that run scoring level, they should generate fewer wins than predicted. And so when I ran that analysis, it turned out to be exactly as I expected. And so if you focus on teams that are in the middle 50% of offensive production, so that's run totals, The teams that are, though, in the top 25% of offensive consistency in that group averaged 2 more wins per year than predicted. That's pretty significant. Again, in that middle 50% of offensive production, if you were in the bottom 25% of offensive consistency, you averaged minus 2.2 wins, so less wins, 2.2 than predicted in the course of that season. And then at the bottom of offensive production, bottom 25%, if you were a top 25% consistency team, but not scoring that many runs, you averaged 5 wins more than predicted in a given season. And if you were just in the average consistency ranks, you averaged 2.5 wins more per season than predicted. So consistency on offense, I believe, is a pretty strong ingredient in increasing win totals in Major League Baseball today.
That is extremely significant to me. I mean, just on the surface, if you are a college baseball team or a high school baseball team or a professional team, if you want to increase your wins, the number one thing that you can do, basically from your findings, is to make your pitching staff better. The second most important thing to do is to make your hitters better. But I think everybody, most people probably would have guessed that those are the two biggest factors. However, those aren't that easy to control. And once your personnel is set, it is what it is. For the most part, especially in college, you for most levels of college, you can't pick up new players halfway through the year. And then the third most consistent, most important thing is your consistency in scoring runs. Let me ask you maybe a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. 5%, you kind of mentioned the 5% increase for, in runs in a season would increase, in run production would be 2 wins, a 5% reduction in runs surrender would equal 3 wins. How big of a number is 5%? Like on paper, it doesn't look like a really big number, but how is that a number that's pretty achievable for teams, scoring or giving up 5% more or fewer runs, and just inconsistency as well? Is 5% a number that, I guess for consistency purposes, Brian, is 5% a number that would be pretty easily achievable if a team chose to? Like, is 5% a really big number or a small number or kind of an in between? I don't know how else to say that.
I get it. I would say it's close to a big number, at least at the MLB level, because you're looking at, for example, if your defense averages 4.3 runs per game against, you'd have to take that down to 4.1. That is non-trivial over the course of a 162-game season. I think that would equate to roughly 32 runs less over the course of the season, if I could do my math off the top of my head correctly. And so that's non-trivial. It's not impossible, but it's non-trivial. On the offensive side, it's about the same. It would be roughly the equivalent of going from 4.2 runs per game to 4.4 on offense. And so getting an additional 30 runs a game, 30 runs a season, that's a fairly significant number to chase at the MLB level when you look at the spread in offensive run totals in a given baseball season. So I would say it's feasible, but it is not easy. Does that make sense?
Certainly, and obviously, there's not a lot of this is easy, and the change in personnel is the biggest thing. I would imagine that if a team were to sign a fairly significant starting pitcher, there could be your 5% almost right there with one guy. Probably, I would imagine the same with signing a pretty significant free agent hitter or having an impact rookie that comes up. You can probably get your 5% from there, I would imagine. But the consistency part of things is obviously what we're focusing on here. And for people that are listening to this podcast, a big part of our audience that figured out, they are, players, parents, coaches of the high school level and below, and even college players and coaches. And I think the lower levels that you go down, having bigger swings in run production, runs surrendered, and consistency is certainly achievable. And can certainly generate more or less wins depending on which direction you're moving. So I guess if and I know your research was based on major league teams, but if we think about teams at lower levels, how would you go about being more consistent as an offense in your estimation from the research you've done and just kind of looking at numbers of the teams throughout the period that you studied, the more consistent teams? Were there certain things that they did on paper more than other teams? And, whether it is more of a focus on small ball, meaning did they sack bunt a little bit more? Did they steal more bases? Or did they attempt more stolen bases? Was there something that you saw in the data that could easily be translated? Because again, going back, looking at a high school team, it's a lot easier for a high school team to steal a base in general than it is for a major league team. I think
Right.
it's easier for a high school team in general to try to create more runs by playing a little bit of small ball, by bunting occasionally, by working in a hit and run, which doesn't show up on paper. But was there something that you saw from the major league teams you studied that was consistent from teams with better run consistency as opposed to a 2018 Dodgers team that had less offensive consistency?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack in that that introduction to that question. So let me start with a couple things. So first, at the MLB level, I think your analysis is spot on, and you started the podcast by noting that depending on the market you're in and the dollars you can commit as an MLB team in the free agent market, et cetera, getting that quality fourth or fifth starter or going out and getting that 30 home run hitter may not be in the cards. And if that's true for your program, then cranking out a bunch of additional runs with very little change in your roster may be difficult on the sort of slug away strategy. And so at that point, I think looking at your roster and thinking about how you can be more consistent in your offensive production can produce dramatic benefits. And I think that's what my research shows. If you're an average or below average run scoring team, focusing on consistency can really move the needle on your win totals over the course of a season. That's at the MLB level. As you move out of MLB into college and high school, or even think about an MLB team that is not blessed with a bunch of 25 plus home run per season guys, how you structure a team to be more consistent, I think, requires more analysis, and that's sort of one of the areas I left open in my paper, and I intend to go back and look at here as my next sort of piece of important, I think, analysis. But there are some clues in the data that we can take a look at from the MLB data, and I think this would be consistent with how college and high school coaches think about the game as well. And so what I did in going back into the data was I decided to take a look at an era of baseball where you were starting to see two different philosophies take hold in MLB baseball in the late 80s, and you had teams that were moving more towards what I would call a current environment approach to offense, lots of home runs, less concern about striking out, fewer stolen bases, fewer sacrifices, etc. So just more of the current style of baseball. And then you had teams that were still playing what I would call sort of the classic small ball model of baseball, exemplified in my view, the two models by the 1987 Mets and the 1987 Cardinals. And I took a careful look at both of those teams, and I realized I'm going way back in MLB, but I thought it was important because this is where you can actually see differences in offensive philosophy that have largely been wiped out in the current era. And if you go back in time, the Mets that year, they put together a team that looked very much like a current launch angle era baseball team. They scored 823 runs, pretty good pitching staff. They only gave up 698, but their weighted on-base average was 335. That's very good. They had 192 home runs. Their strikeout percentage was high by 87 standards, low by modern standards. They were at 16%. Sacrifices, both bunts and flies, 109, so higher than what's happening today in the game, but not high by 87 standards. And he stole 159 bases, so pretty active on the bases. but not high by, again, 1987 standards. And they were predicted to win 93 games that year. The Cards, by contrast, I'm sorry I'm going through all the details, but this will make sense in a second. The Cards scored fewer runs. They had 798, gave up basically the same number of runs against. Their weighted on-base average was much lower, 317. Most notably, they only hit 94 home runs that year. Their strikeout percentage was lower than the Mets, but not super low, it was 14.8. But they had more sacrifices and substantially more stolen bases, and their expected win total was 91. For the historians who are listening to the podcast, they'll already know what I'm about to say, but what was really interesting about comparing these two teams is that the Cardinals, of course, won 95 games that year. The Mets won 92, and the Cardinals went on to the World Series. They did not win the World Series, but they were an excellent team that year. And when I looked at their relative consistency measures, the Mets were pretty good at .646, but the Cardinals were outstanding at .616. And so there are hints, I think, Jeff, in this data about what a more consistent offense would entail, and that would include things like, if you're not a home run hitting team, you've got to figure out ways to get your guys around the bases on their own, stolen bases, or by moving them. And then if you get a runner to third base with less than 2 outs, you need to make sure you get that run one way or another. And I think the Cards sort of exemplified that in 1987 and were able to, as I said, be the team that on paper should have won more games and certainly subscribe to the current offensive philosophy that dominates MLB, or was closer to it anyway. So I think there are clues there, but I don't think we have all the answers right now about what would make a team more consistent on offense and how to achieve that consistency on purpose. And I say that because I don't believe, with a handful of exceptions, that very many teams in the modern era are intentionally trying to create consistency on offense by the way they manage the game and structure certain innings. I think more likely in the modern era, consistency is the result of just having better hitters in your lineup on a regular basis rather than any kind of intentional effort to, as they used to say, manufacture runs. So I really am looking forward to digging into that precise question in terms of seeing what we can tease out of the data from the last 12 years for what I'll call core ingredients to a more consistent offense. But I also think that some of this is going to have to be hypothesized and tested, whether that's done at the MLB level through or using minor leagues in professional baseball or spring training. But I think people are going to think more creatively about this and test certain ideas, gather the data, and see what they show, as well as look at what's been done historically. And I think through those two processes, we could come up with a pretty good idea of how you can be more consistent intentionally on offense.
Here's an interesting dichotomy to me, is that my involvement in higher level baseball has been in college baseball, primarily when I've been on the field coaching. And this is something that you and I have discussed in other conversations that we've had, Brian, but I think it's worth bringing up now that I've coached for some very, very good teams. I've coached under some really good head coaches who have had and who continue to have a lot of success. And these guys are guys that produce really good offenses, that hit a lot of doubles and home runs. But it seems like, from my own experience and from many, many conversations I've had through podcasts that I've done here and just general conversations with coaches throughout the years, that I think that consistently in the college game, as much as coaches love home runs and doubles, offensively, I believe that most college coaches out there also are spending time with their players to be able to play small ball when the game calls for it. And I believe, at least in my own perspective, I got lucky enough where I am an associate scout with the Pirates, but I'm also a lifelong Pirates fan. It just so happens that that's the team I kind of caught on with as an associate scout. but I'm a big Pirates fan. I watch, you know, probably 160 out of their 162 games of the year on TV and the ones I don't go to in person. Uh, it appears that most major league teams can't play that style of baseball, even if they needed to win a game, which I think comes back to the 2018 Dodgers team that you're talking about in the World Series, the 18 inning game, where they were just unwilling to try to play small ball or to push a run across. And it was like one of these teams is going to hit a home run, and that's the team that's going to win. And it was almost like there wasn't even the option of something else happening. Whereas in the college game, it seems like I would say a very vast majority of college baseball programs out there, even at Power Five levels, but trickling down to mid-major and small Division Ones, Division Two, Division Three, NAIA programs, junior college programs. It seems like they at least spend some time with their players, even if it's not a significant part of their practice time or their game execution, but they spend time with all their players on being able to put down a bunt when necessary, being able to steal a base, being able to execute a hit and run when necessary. And I say this like I'm not a big fan of small ball. I really don't believe in bunting at any point in the first 2/3 of the game until you kind of know how the game's going to play out. But when it comes to the seventh, eighth, and ninth innings, if it becomes pretty apparent that an extra run or potentially 2 runs is going to be the difference in this game, and this is where my background in college baseball comes in, like we got to find a way to score that run one way or another, and waiting around for the long ball is not always the best way to go about it, especially if you have an offense, a lineup that is capable of hitting home runs, but yet you maybe only have 1 to 2 guys that you would quote unquote call a home run hitter in your lineup. It just seems like that's a tool that's not in a lot of toolboxes in the major leagues, which as fans, which you and I are, I think produces boring games to watch sometimes, but also when it comes time to when you have these long extra inning games and there are so many pitching changes and the pitchers that are coming in are really outstanding, which that may be some of the offensive thought processes. The pitchers are so good, you're not going to string together several hits. We have to wait for the long ball. But as you mentioned, the Dodgers got a leadoff guy on 4 times, and the next guy either struck out or popped up each of those 4 times. Um, I guess the point of this is that I think that there is a time and a place to be able to do that and to have the ability to manufacture a run, meaning not just wait till you get a hit or hit a ball over the fence, but put something in motion, make something happen on offense to be able to score a run when it's necessary. And I don't mean to take over the podcast, Brian, but it's just something that
Yep.
I think really applies and something that you and I have talked about in other conversations. And sort of the point of the offensive consistency, I think probably comes back to in a close ball game, a 1 or 2 run game, having the ability to create runs when maybe it's just not as easy as swinging away, because the way that major league bullpens are structured right now, they're so good. Guys throw so hard. It's not always easy to string together 2 or 3 hits, and it's not always a high percentage bet to wait on, a bloop and a blast or a walk and a homer or whatever it is to put up 2 runs on the board. So I guess, again, coming back to my point, it's something that seems to be taken out of the major league game altogether. And part of your analysis was sort of looking at teams, just say some major league teams kind of, they put together their offense, their lineup a different way. Some teams, like the Cardinals last year with Matt Carpenter, will have one of their best home run hitters leading off. A lot of times a more traditional lineup would see your like 3, 4, 5 hitters kind of be your power guys. But I think every lineup, National League or American League, has at least 3 spots in the lineup that usually come back to back to back, whether it's the 7, 8, 9 hitters or whatever it may be, that really don't have a lot of thump in their lineup. They don't have a lot of home run hitting potential, yet most teams are trying to score runs that way, even with 7, 8, 9 in the lineup. Part of your analysis, Brian, was kind of rethinking that. Would you mind talking about that? And I'll shut up. Let people listen to you, which is why they're here. Would you mind talking a little bit about that and just about your thoughts on lineup construction, or how those 7, 8, 9 type of hitters who aren't likely to hit the ball over the wall, how a team could go about producing more runs with that part of the lineup, which in turn would make their offense more consistent?
Yeah, no, these are great areas, and I'm going to preface everything I have to say with 2 points. One, major league hitters have an unbelievable challenge in front of them every time they step up to face a major league pitcher, and I don't want to suggest that anything, getting a hit, getting a home run, or laying down a good bunt is easy. It's not. So I don't want anyone to misunderstand my view of the world and come away thinking that I believe incorrectly, right, that all this is easy to accomplish. There are challenges with anything I'm about to discuss, and I don't want to suggest otherwise. Secondly, I've only started to hypothesize in a lot of these areas. I haven't done the digging, and I think that's where a lot of the interesting analysis is going to come from. But to the points you were making, Jeff, I think the data show quite clearly that bunting for a base hit, stolen bases, hit and run, run and hit, any number of what might be called manufacturing runs or small ball techniques, although I don't know all of them neatly fit into that category, they're on the decline. They're becoming lost art forms in Major League Baseball, and there's a lot of evidence of that. But in my view, you could look at the data about the ability to hit opposite field, as well as the sort of unwillingness or inability to bunt or slap against the shift, especially for left-handed hitters. And with those offensive techniques out of the game, it does produce the dynamic that you're talking about, which is that it's often stand around on, if you get somebody on the base, it's wait around to see if someone can hit the ball very hard to score the run. And that definitely has impacts on fan interest in the game. I love seeing home runs as much as the next guy, but I don't really like seeing three guys come up to hit and do nothing while somebody stands on first base for the inning, right, the converse scenario. And that's definitely happening in the game today. How do we break out of that dynamic, or how could a team break out of that dynamic? I think you're right in both your instincts. So you have sort of what I'll call playing situational probabilities, and then you have batting order optimization, and the two go together. They're not separate. But situational probability, let me give you an example of what I mean by this. I'm going to make it a pretty extreme example, so it's pretty obvious what I'm getting at. But if you get your leadoff runner on, let's say he's your number 6 hitter in an inning, and he's pretty fast, and your 7 and 8 hitters are ground ball hitters primarily with fairly low contact rates and don't get a lot of walks, what are the odds that they're going to move that runner over to second or third ultimately? They're pretty low. I mean, actual situational probabilities, they're pretty low. You're more likely to get to third base with less than one out in that circumstance if you have the runner do it himself or do half of it himself. And you can debate whether he steals second and you bum to third, or bunt him to second, steal third, let him steal both bases. But in any event, in that circumstance, you want to begin thinking, I believe, about manufacturing a run and using the base runner's talents to get to third base with less than one out, recognizing who the hitters are coming behind, right? And that's just one extreme example of how you might reorient your offense to create a quality scoring chance and be more consistent, rather than, as you were hypothesizing, and I think the data will show, a lot of teams would simply hit away in that circumstance. The base runner would be frozen at first, and they're just hoping that the 7 or 8 hitter or the combination of the two will produce a run, or maybe 2, or maybe 3, as the case may be. And I think that's something that needs to be explored in greater detail. I think the other issue is how you might think about your batting order in the modern game to create more quality scoring chances, especially in the second half of your batting order. And as you noted, teams have experimented sometimes with their most powerful and best overall hitter in the leadoff spot, and I actually think we will likely see, we should see more of that actually in the coming seasons, because I think structuring your lineup to be sort of best all-around hitters up front could produce some consistency and run scoring advantages. Let me contrast that with putting your fastest guy in the leadoff spot. Putting your fastest guy in the leadoff spot isn't really a great idea unless you're going to let him use his speed. Otherwise, the speed is wasted for the most part. Yeah, you could talk about getting 2 bases on certain kinds of singles and things like that where base speed is going to be relevant. But by and large, if you don't let him steal, you're not really capitalizing on your leadoff hitter's speed. Whereas in the scenario I just hypothesized, right, if you had your fastest guy batting 6th and he got on base in front of your presumably 2 weakest everyday hitters, 7 and 8, and then you have your 9 spot presumably for your pitcher or a pinch hitter, speed in the 6th slot when that runner is on base as the leadoff hitter can make a huge difference for your ability to score runs in any game and over the course of a 162 game season. And then I think the last point worth mentioning, and then we can get into more specific examples if you'd like, is just one of the things that I don't think has been clearly or carefully studied is the value of putting consistent pressure on the other team. And you've coached at a very high level, but it is demoralizing to an opponent when you score every inning, I believe. And I think the data would show that this actually has a positive impact on your win percentage, but again, it needs to be studied. But if you're constantly scoring, every inning you're putting at least a 1 on the board. Maybe it's just 1 on the board, but if you're constantly putting pressure on the other team, it's deflating, it's demoralizing. And at some point, if you put a lot of pressure, even at the MLB level, and I think we've seen this in the playoffs, the postseason, if you put a lot of pressure on the other team, you can produce errors, even among the most gifted professionals in the world. So that, to me, also is a consideration that I think hasn't really been fully explored in the modern game, and one that I'd like to take a harder look at if I could find the right data to tease that out.
Yeah, and some of those things are, I don't know. I'm not a statistician. I don't have an analytics background. I've read a lot about statistics just as a coach, just to try to learn as much as I can. But some of those things may be hard to quantify. I don't know, such as just if you by putting more pressure on defense, can you create more errors and things like that? Certainly at the high school level you can, and I think in college you can as well. I know that the teams that I've coached have just basically told our players that if you play the game at 100% speed, if you hit a ground ball to short, and you're running hard down the line, you're going to create more errors throughout the year. Maybe not on every play, but if there's a little bit of a bob or a little bit of a mishandle, then you force a rushed throw. And I think that throughout the course of the season, you're going to see more errors. And that's probably more so true at the lower levels than at the major league level. But I still think it is true to a degree. To what degree may be difficult to find. And just some of the other things that you said they really resonate. With the major leagues right now, I've read things, and you've alluded to potentially the rule of potentially having a DH in the National League, which as a fan, I'm not a fan of, despite the fact that as a college coach, I certainly don't want my pitchers to have to hit. But as a fan, I think it makes for a more fun game. And I may be in the minority there, but I like going to a game and seeing the manager have to make a decision in the bottom of the 5th with 2 guys on and the pitcher spot due up. Is he going to take his starting pitcher out, even though he's cruising, and let him only go 5 innings and have to get 4 innings out of your bullpen, or is he going to leave his pitcher in there? Like, to me, that's an interesting part of the game, and something that I hope we don't lose. But obviously, no one's asking my opinion about that. But the major league game is, Brian, it's for fans, and the reason they're exploring these options is because they're trying to make the game better for fans. And I've also read recently that they are thinking about moving the pitcher's mound back or lowering it.
Lowering it, I think. Yep.
As a way to produce more offense. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that so the mound is 10 inches high now, and I believe it used to be 15, and it was moved down at one point, maybe in the 60s when pitching was extremely dominant, and that had a big impact on offense. So they're doing these things to be able to create more offense. But at least for me, I'd rather not see rule changes. I'd rather just teams make adjustments. And the teams that need to make adjustments aren't, today, even though they aren't the Astros and the Dodgers that are already producing a lot of runs. Of course, those teams are going to try to stay ahead of everybody else. But to me, it's the Pirates of the world who are not going to have a payroll that's at the top. Like, they need to find a way to score more runs, and it's like Moneyball 2. You and I have discussed that. Moneyball originally was the emphasis on base percentage as opposed to home runs. Because a small market team is not going to be able to replace 35 homers when they lose a free agent. When they lose a guy that came up through their system that has a great, 5 or 6 years, whatever it is, and hits free agency, or they trade him before he hits free agency, that's going to be really hard to duplicate. But the idea with Moneyball was to replace that with a high on base percentage. Now other teams have figured that out, and every team sort of does that. So on base percentage is no longer sort of a diamond in the rough. It's just what everybody does. But it's like there's got to be something out there that other teams like the Pirates or like the Reds or like the Rays or whomever it may be, the teams that don't have the big payrolls can do to have an advantage and to compete. And in my opinion, this idea of consistency, not trying to play, you can't try to beat the Yankees, by playing their style of baseball. It's not, they're going to have, they're going to have better pitchers from their 1 through 5 starter, and then their bullpen, they're going to be a little bit better than most other teams outside of, the Red Sox. In their lineup, I've read about them, potentially trying to sign Bryce Harper and throw Bryce Harper in that lineup. Like, my God, how do you try to outslug that team? But there's got to be a way to have a statistical advantage, and to me, the consistency is the obvious answer for teams, but how to do that is probably not so easy to do, or at least maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe you need to look at the way the college game is played and sort of adapt that. And actually, I saw recently that the Orioles have hired a coach named Tom Eller, who is the head coach at Hartford Community College. It's a junior college in Maryland, and that team is consistently in the top of the national, the NJCA, the junior college circuit in home runs and stolen bases, and they actually don't strike out very much either for putting up those big numbers. And I just thought it was interesting, and I'm kind of coming full circle here that the Orioles hired a guy like that. So maybe the Orioles are an organization that are looking at guys who can help to produce more runs, other than just teaching guys, trying to hit home runs. And home runs is important, but maybe they're looking into the value in trying to steal a base from time to time, and
Right.
and to maybe not strike out as much in certain situations. Whereas now it's like, why would I try to hit a single, and when I can try to hit a home run, and who cares if I strike out? And the idea you brought up about having your speed guy in the 6 hole of your lineup, if you have your best runner, your best stolen base threat in the leadoff spot, and you've got your best hitter up, sometimes managers are hesitant to run that guy because they don't want to get him thrown out when your best
Right.
hitter is hitting, and he's got a chance to hit a home run at any point.
Yeah, no, you'll clearly hear, and the announcers will say it too, don't take the bat out of the hitter's hands. And that is true in certain scenarios, for sure. But it's also untrue in certain scenarios. And I feel like Major League Baseball has forgotten that. And, to the point that you were making, I think college plays the game in a more joyful and well-rounded way on offense, right, if that makes sense. And hopefully they won't lose sight of that going forward. And I do think there are opportunities for teams at the MLB level to disrupt, right? When every team is playing the same style of baseball and you can't compete playing that style of baseball, you have to innovate. And as you said, the Moneyball era was an innovation. It was on-base percentage is undervalued. We can acquire high OBP guys at prices we can afford. And, if you have a great OBP lineup, you are a perpetual run-scoring machine, right? If nobody gets out, you keep scoring runs. You just turn the lineup over and over, and you score runs. Yeah, and the A's innovated, and then everyone caught on. Today, you need innovation, and you need managers empowered to make decisions based on those innovations. And, we're talking about what might be undervalued today. And again, I don't know precisely. You have to look at the research a little bit, but it's quite possible, for example, that being able to hit the ball in the opposite field is undervalued today. And that may be something that needs to be looked at, because if you've got runners on, first or second, if you can advance them even on an out, that can be enormously valuable. And of course, if you can advance them by hitting a single to the opposite field, that has enormous value. I believe that speed is undervalued in the game today, and it may be that it's some combination of speed plus reaction time, right? Being able to get the jump on the pitcher, because pitchers are throwing super hard now. But reaction times, I'm not sure to what extent those are actually measured in scouting, preseason, things of that nature. But that can make the difference between getting tossed out and successfully stealing. And it may be that's an area where a team looking to innovate and disrupt could really make a difference. So those are just a couple ideas. I'd have to get into the data more. Some of it, as I said, has to be hypothesized. There isn't going to be any data to support the theory right now. Someone would have to try it out. But I'm with you. I think there are opportunities for teams to look at their roster, look at their lineup, and make conscious, data-informed decisions that in certain circumstances they're going to play the game a little bit differently, maybe a lot differently, than it's typically being played today, in an effort to create quality scoring chances and score runs more consistently, and therefore win more games over the course of the season.
And sort of have the mentality of, what do we need to do to win today? And of course, you never know the outcome of the game until it's over, but I think there comes a point in the game when you can make a pretty good educated guess as to, what
Right.
direction this game is going. Is it going to be, a 13-12 slugfest, or is it going to be 2-1? And I think that I think you can see that as the game starts to unfold, especially in the last couple of innings. One of the things I just read an article recently, Brian, just about how managers in the major leagues are really becoming obsolete, and how before the game even begins, there's so much data that is collected and that is given to the manager that it's almost like the lineup's being written from upstairs. And, in this situation here, the moves you're going to make, and in this situation here, the moves you're going to make. And it's like major league managers are kind of obsolete, and they pointed to how much major league managers are making, how much money they're earning. And there's not that much money being put into major league managers as opposed to what's being pumped into the players. And, don't you think that a manager that could just have a feel for the game and could make some decisions and had his team prepared to score a run in any number of ways, as opposed to just hitting, the ball over the wall and automatically going to your seventh inning guy, then your eighth inning guy, then your ninth inning guy? Don't you think that a manager could be the starting point of that process for some teams, where you had a manager who you trusted to actually make decisions and have a feel for the game, day to day, to make some decisions? And wouldn't that potentially lead to a more consistent offense throughout the season, in your opinion?
So you put your finger on an issue that transcends baseball analytics and really enters the world of analytics and artificial intelligence, and issues that sort of cross-cut environments, from national security to how financial institutions work to internet advertising and the like. But you put your finger on what I would call a critical issue in the use of analytics, and it's this. Are analytics a decision-making tool? In other words, they put information in the hands of a person to make a better and more informed decision under the circumstances, or do analytics become the decision maker? And when I was running my applied analytics firm, we had a very clear bias, and I think it was well designed and worked out well, that analytics were a decision support tool. They were not intended to be the decision maker. And as brilliant as statisticians and operations research and data science and computer science professionals are, and they are absolutely brilliant, have to have a place for a human in the loop, in my view, to make better decisions at critical junctures. And you and I both know there are so many factors that go into a decision at any point in the game, and only so many of those are going to be taken into account by whatever model is being run to provide the manager decision maker with information. And so I believe, as you do, that there's a role, and there should be a role, for managers to make these decisions in individual circumstances. The other thing I'll say is, and obviously the models that are being run, the data that's being generated by each MLB team is proprietary. So I don't have any insight into what is going into the modeling being done that produces the piece of paper that's being handed to the manager that says do this. But what I do know from personal experience is that how you set up your model, the data you put into it, and the circumstances for which you think it's valid versus those where it's not, those are all critical. And if you mess up any piece of that process or sequence, the outputs from your model are not going to be reliable. And sometimes it's the person who spots the process flaw, the methodological problem in the model. It's not the data scientists, it's not the statisticians. And so that's just another way of agreeing with you, Jeff, that in my view, there ought to be room for decision makers at every level to get data inputs, and they should have good data in front of them, but then be trusted and empowered to make a decision that may not be the one that is spit out by, the black box computer being run from the, operations research department at the MLB franchise. And, I think there's probably in the data that I'll hopefully be able to tease out in the future, there's probably evidence to support that. And so, yeah, that's my current view of how these tools should be brought to bear in the game of baseball.
I think it's so cool to be able to talk to you at the beginning of this process. Like if we waited 3 or 4 years to have a podcast, you would have done a significant amount more research. But now it's like there's been some research done. There are some hypotheses, and it'll be interesting to see how things play out. And as you conduct more research, we certainly would like to have you back on here. But I mean, as a guy with a risk analytics background, applied analytics background, I just think it's so significant that you said that analytics should be a decision support tool. And that, to me as a fan, seems to be the part of the game, and it seems like you agree with this based on things that you've said, that has really been kind of taken out of the game and is taken out of the manager's hand, is that, the decision or the opportunity to kind of go with your gut on this. And I think that Joe Madden, as a Pirates fan, I'm not a Cubs fan by any means, but I think that Joe Madden is probably one of the few managers in the game who is allowed to make a gut decision. And it seems like it, some seasons more than others, but it works for him a lot. And I guess I wish that some teams would try that a little bit. So you and I have also discussed in other phone calls that we've had, and I won't keep it too much longer, Brian. But we've discussed, potentially trying some things out in the minor leagues or even in spring training, like which a lot of teams do with different things. But do you think that this is something that teams could benefit from trying out at the other levels? Just try some other things out besides just looking at black and white numbers on a piece of paper. Do you think it's worth it for a team to maybe try a different philosophy in the minor leagues and see how that affects their run consistency as opposed to that minor league team's run consistency in the past? And it may be difficult to know because in minor leagues you're changing personnel a lot, but do you think that's a valid way to kind of get things started with? Because obviously if you're making a change at the major league level, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. Like you're planning that working this year, or people are probably going to get fired. Do you think it's legitimate to maybe look at trying to start that in your lower levels of a system, or do you think that because the lineups are so inconsistent and because players are changing so often at those levels that it wouldn't work as well? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we'll start MLB and then we'll go minor league. So, at the MLB level, you'd have to have the courage of your convictions, right, to test a new offensive philosophy in the regular season. And that comes with, you got to have thick skin. The front office is going to have to be really supportive, and you're going to have to give it the full 162 games. And you might have to give it 2 seasons, quite frankly, before you really figure out if it's working or not. That being said, there are clearly teams in both leagues where you might say they have nothing to lose by shifting gears and trying something different. And maybe one of them will give it a shot, and we'll just have to see and quite frankly hope. I think that innovation on offense, consistency innovation on offense, creeps its way into the major league regular season at some point in the not too distant future for the fans, especially. But I think just for the love of the game, and the reason that you alluded to earlier about the National League having pitchers hit, it creates critical inflection points in the game where strategy really comes into play. And to a lot of baseball fans, that is the critical thing about baseball. It's the same flavor as looking at how a shortstop is positioned based on who the hitter is and where the pitcher is going to throw the pitch, right? And how he moves with every pitch, because it's strategy. Is the hitter going to roll over? Is he going to go this way? Are we going to get a swing and a miss? All that stuff. I love that part of the game. I think a lot of fans do too, and some of that is now clearly missing from MLB baseball. Testing these ideas in the minor leagues. So you're right that you have player turnover. Guys are going up, guys are going down, and that will be a challenge to manage. But you have that every season. So over time, your historical data will be reliable as a barometer of how you played the game with various personnel packages in the past. And I think if you don't make major changes to the way that players are moved up or down in a minor league franchise, you can commit to a new philosophy, agree that you will use it consistently and not deviate from it, and generate interesting data, I believe, that will tell you whether it's working or not. Now, what the window of time would be before you can make real judgment calls about whether it's working, that I don't know. Right now, I'd have to go back and think about that and think about how many seasons, if you need more than one, before you can draw any conclusions that have any validity. But I think it could be done. And, I think that it would be one way for a program to really test a lot of different theories and come out well-equipped with data about what's going to work and what's not going to work if you'd applied it at the major league level. All that being said, Jeff, that might also collide with player development objectives. I don't know exactly. That would be an interesting discussion with a front office, its analytics department, as well as its player development, and then obviously the minor league managerial staff in question to kind of make sure you don't sacrifice one important objective in the minors to get to another. But overall, I think it's manageable and it could be done.
Right. I guess a couple thoughts that I had. First of all, it almost seems like if you couldn't get reliable enough data in one season, it almost might not be worth doing, because it's like Major League Baseball moves so quickly that if it took you longer than a year to experiment with something, like, other teams are probably going to pass you by in the meantime by doing something different, or even doing what you're doing and applying it right away at the major league level. And I guess just from a player development standpoint, just my personal thoughts. I don't think that it would really get in the way of player development if, just for example, you're asking a guy who normally is, a potential 30 home run guy in your lineup in the minor leagues, and, once every couple of weeks you ask him to execute a hit and run, or,
right.
it's not like like you're changing his everyday approach, and obviously the guys you have in the minor leagues that can run, that have some have some speed, why not try to see how you can use that speed to create more runs in the minor leagues? It's a tool they have, and you're almost trying to exploit that tool a little bit more. Or a guy that doesn't have 30 home run potential, like, hey, let's try to bring this guy up so that he can handle the bat a little better and he is able to hit basically from line to line. To me,
Right.
that's something you've brought up with guys just being able to potentially hit the other way. And I know that the thought process is right now, well, why would I try to hit a backside single when I can, try to hit a home run in this at bat? But at the same time, if you can get rid of those shifts, and if you're a power hitter, if you can, work to be able to hit the ball out from right center gap to left center gap, if not from line to line, then I think you become more dangerous, and probably teams are going to have a harder time shifting on you if you can use the whole field, and it's not necessarily if you hit a ground ball, it's going to be to your pull side. But anyway, those are just kind of
Right.
my thoughts. So Brian, you've met with some college teams. And you've spoken with them, and I haven't been privileged to but I'd like to ask you, kind of when you're having those conversations with these college teams, what are the conversations you're having? Are you kind of approaching them like, I think I can help you to score more runs? Are you approaching them to say, I'd like to run some data on your team and see where it takes me? Like, what have those conversations been like with some of the college programs that you've spoken to?
Sort of all of the above, Jeff. And I went in really with sort of two ideas in mind. One, to talk to them about what I was seeing at the major league level and get feedback on whether I was thinking about the game the right way and whether they're seeing these kinds of issues creep into the college game, right, in terms of more emphasis on launch angle and power, less on well-rounded offensive baseball, and just kind of have a wide-ranging discussion about whether I was on the right track in terms of thinking about offensive baseball at the higher levels of the game, because I don't have that personal experience. And I really like talking with other smart guys like you about the game and making sure that I'm not missing something as I put together my analytical framework. And those were fun, wide-ranging discussions. And I think from my vantage point, I don't want to put words in any of the coaching staff's mouths, but I think the general consensus was that this is starting to trickle into college baseball. But most college baseball coaches instinctively, but maybe not informed by data, believe that they need to look for opportunities to manufacture runs, to be aggressive on the bases, to put pressure on the defense, in part because, as you've noted, defenses just, even though they're very good, are not nearly as good at the college level as they are at the MLB level, right? So there's more opportunity to pressure and harass defense, produce errors, and score runs. But I think they have a general instinctive view that that they can be more creative and well-rounded on offense and win more games that way. And I think the discussions from there were pretty interesting because then it was, well, the data sort of confirms some of this. That's terrific. I'm glad to know that. I'm well empowered now as a college coach to continue to do the things that I'm doing, because there are because the launch angle error mentality is trickling down to college. There are now increasing pressures, I think, on college coaches to play the game more the way the MLB style is being played, and I think coaches would like to be able to not gravitate towards that model unless they're convinced it's going to produce more wins. So I think they're happy to have data that suggests there are other ways to approach the game. I think the second sort of line of discussions, which are open and by no means concluded, really boil down to the issues I sort of left open in my paper, but we talked about a little bit and hinted at on this call, which is, okay, I already believe that consistency is important. I think it is going to help me win more games. Here are some of the things I'm doing as a coach to be more consistent. What else can I do? What are the other techniques? What are the lineup construction options I have? how do I approach certain situations to try to create that extra level of consistency over the course of a 40 to 60 game, college campaign. And not sure exactly, those are ongoing discussions where they're going to take me, but it would be really interesting and fun to try to work through and, essentially test at the college level some of these ideas and see programs innovate and use data to drive more success at the college level, and quite frankly continue a very entertaining style of baseball. I know you and I have talked about this before, but we're lucky to have two college programs that play great baseball here, and then we also have the Summer Collegiate League here, and I love going to those games. So does my 14-year-old son. They are fun because they're active. There's a lot of action, and it's quick. So those are some of the things that we've been kicking around so far, and I'm hoping that I'll have an opportunity to continue those discussions with the college programs going forward, because I think there's a lot of opportunity to use data to innovate and win at every level.
And just looking at baseball as an entertainment industry, which it really it is, and there's been a lot of discussion in the last, I don't know how many years, that that baseball needs to get more young people interested and involved. And to me, what you just said is not something to cast aside. Is that for a young kid going to a game, for a 14-year-old, or like if you're taking your 10-year-old to a major league game right now, there's just not an incredible amount of action as compared to if you go to a college game or a collegiate summer league game, which is played with wooden bats. They're fast moving games. There's a lot of stuff happening. There's a good bit of action, where sometimes the major league games are 3.5, 4 hours, and they're kind of a snooze fest sometimes. As much as I love the game, that's just kind of how it is. And if you want to get young kids more interested and involved, there's got to be a way to make the game a little more fast-paced and interesting, which I think people realize, and I think that the commissioner and just people involved in the game understand that, but they're not quite sure how to do it. And I'm not saying that I know how to do it either, but somehow or another, there's got to be a way. Maybe the two things go hand in hand. The kind of middle tier teams, as far as payroll goes, figure out a different way to get an advantage over the teams that have the big payroll and the big power hitters and the big power arms that are going to be Cy Young candidates. And maybe by doing that, those kind of middle tier teams bring back a style of game that's a little more interesting to watch, and then the younger audience comes back. I don't know. Maybe those things go hand in hand. Maybe they don't. Who knows?
Yeah, that's my hope for sure, which is that because I'm somewhat of a, if not a complete, traditionalist in terms of the game, so I'd hate to see major rule changes in baseball in order to produce improved pace of play and try to engage fans that way. I think it'd be better for the game if the style of play produced more fan interest, and you didn't do it to produce fan interest. That was the byproduct of a style of play that was going to help you win.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I'm hopeful. And like you said, I mean, you want to have young people interested in the game, but you've got to compete for their attention. And that's a challenge right now.
Last question, Brian. What's the next step for you going forward? You've produced this paper. You're getting more and more into analytics, and obviously your background is extremely conducive, to the analytics side of things, and your interest in baseball. I mean, it's a perfect marriage. But what is the next step for you?
So I think it's probably 2 or 3 next steps. One, I want to continue to get into the data on the questions that I've raised but not been able to answer. So, for example, can I find clues in historical MLB data about what the critical ingredients are to a more consistent offense, and are they applicable in today's game? And then if I can't find the clues because I can't find the data I need, can I convince can I go find it somewhere else through non-open sources, or convince someone to work with me, to go get it in some fashion? Because I'm interested in this, and I think this inquiry will contribute to the dialogue surrounding the game as it's being played today, and hopefully spur, and I do hope, spur some changes in the way the offensive game is being played today. So I think that's number one for me. Number two is, obviously, as that continues, I would love the opportunity, Jeff, to keep working with you on these podcasts and your audience, and bringing interesting findings to their attention. I think the more people who are interested in the game and have data available to them, the better off the sport is. So that'd be number two. And then, number three, if I had my druthers, ideally I'd be able to do some work with a program or a set of programs going forward that we're really interested in how you use applied analytical tools to improve your chances of winning one game or a lot of games over the course of a season. And we focused on offense today, and that has been my emphasis so far in my research, but you can apply these tools and techniques to just about any facet of the game. And I would welcome the opportunity to do that again going forward, as I continue to return, if you will, to my applied analytics roots through the prism of baseball. So that's, I think, the future for me, if I can continue to get into the data and find interesting wrinkles to share.
Brian, I thank you so much for being here today with us on the podcast. This is Brian Goebel, everybody. He is got a really impressive analytics background and is applying that to almost as a hobby, but a very serious hobby in baseball, because of his love for the game and his son's interest in the game. I think has a big part of it as well. But Brian, we really, really appreciate you spending time with us on the podcast today. I think it's a no-doubter that we're going to have you back again. Once you dig into the research a little bit more and get some findings from you. But thank you so much for your time. This has been great for me. For me personally, this is an area of interest, and I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot from you, and I'm looking forward to doing this again with you sometime.